Hey, it's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to conclude Lesson 4 with Lesson 4B. And what we did, of course, is we gave you unit focus question and we gave you the lesson focus questions, of course, for this particular lesson in Lesson 4A. What we're going to do is start talking a little bit about Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft and what their take, of course, on diplomacy was or imperialism was. And what we'll also do, of course, is go through and answer a few practice questions at the end. What we're going to do today, of course, is we're going to pick up with dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy would be the foreign policy utilized by William Howard Taft, who succeeds Theodore Roosevelt, of course, as President of the United States of America. And its use was the use of the American dollar to gain influence with other nations, particularly in Latin America, where Theodore Roosevelt, of course, used the Navy, of course, to intimidate nations into doing what we wanted them to do, of course, in this country. What the next president, of course, you know, the hand-picked successor of Roosevelt would do, William Howard Taft, is he took a different approach. And that approach, of course, is used the American dollar to gain influence by giving loans or rejecting loans when nations, of course, didn't do the things that we needed them to do, or investing in places if they didn't do what we needed them to do. So, and when dollar diplomacy didn't work, he reverted back to doing what his predecessor had done, what Roosevelt had done, of course, is by using big stick diplomacy in the U.S. Navy. Taft wanted to lift those nations out of poverty through American investment and replace European nation debt influence by paying off their debts to Europeans and settling debts with the United States. One of the biggest areas of contention that European nations had with the United States of America is they thought the United States of America was trying to interfere with their opportunities, of course, to gain loans back from nations, of course, in the Western Hemisphere that they had extended lines of credit to. Here's a picture, a cartoon of William Howard Taft and dollar diplomacy. It says obedience to the law, economy, ship subsidy, currency reform, prompt judicial action. And then you look at it, it says Roosevelt's policy was down here. So when looking at it, what we're telling you is this here, that his approach is a little bit different, but when his approach doesn't work, he reverts back to Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. And he did so because he could. Moral diplomacy. Moral diplomacy was created by President Woodrow Wilson. This was his foreign policy goals. Wilson was an isolationist at heart and was mostly concerned with domestic affairs. He wanted the U.S. to promote democracy and be a moral example for the rest of the world. In other words, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were imperialists. They thought that in terms of looking at the United States of America, that in order to support American business, we had to have those markets, and we had to have those spheres of influence, of course, around the world to gain natural resources if we needed them and to gain markets. Woodrow Wilson's a little bit different now, and his take, what he decides, of course, is that we should be more concerned with what's going on at home in our own country and not worrying about what's going on, of course, around the rest of the world. So he concentrates more on his domestic policy than his foreign policy. And it's just about, one of those situations where it's the best laid plans. And what happens is this: he wants to concentrate on domestic things here in the United States of America, but because some incidences that happen around the world, particularly World War I, he is not going to be able to do that. His views changed with the U.S. involvement in World War I and the Mexican Revolution. Violence from the Mexican War spilled into the United States as Mexican guerrillas led by Pancho Villa attacked the town of Columbus in New Mexico. And because of that, because of these two instances, rather than being able to concentrate on domestic affairs, which is what he wanted to do, he couldn't do so because foreign affairs kind of pulled him into it. Here's a picture of Woodrow Wilson. This is just thinking, just the thing for my new knock 'em down policy. Now, what we told you is that he wanted to elevate and uplift these countries around the world, but just like Taft, just like TR, when he wasn't able to achieve his goals using his own foreign policy, what he did, of course, is revert back to big stick diplomacy. Because, once again, the United States of America had the Great White Fleet, the great Navy, and we could do what we wanted to do to influence nations around the world. Moral diplomacy was the nickname given to Wilson's foreign policy, as his policy looked a lot like, even though it looked a lot like Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, Wilson's actions included sending General John J. Person to Mexico to capture Pancho Villa, the creation of naval bases in Nicaragua, sending troops to Haiti to put down a rebellion, sending troops to the Dominican Republic to set up a more stable government. Yeah, even though he wanted to concentrate on domestic affairs, foreign policy becomes very big because he has to deal with all these situations that come up around the world. All right, what we're going to do is in Lesson 4A, we gave you 3 lesson focused questions that we wanted to go, of course, and look at. And what we're going to do is look at those questions now. First question is, what effect did the likelihood of spheres of influence in China have on the United States? Well, the answer to that is the United States wanted to safeguard American access to Chinese markets from foreign influence, and American business leaders needed access to markets for American oil, textiles, and steel. The establishment of spheres of influence by European nations would hamper U.S. efforts to sell products. Question number 2, in terms of the lesson-focused questions, is what effect did President Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy have on U.S. relations with other nations? Well, the U.S. could use use of threats with the American Navy usually led to peaceful resolution of conflicts like in Panama, but also made the U.S. a target to be called a bully. So Great White Fleet was able to, to do what it was supposed to do, and when we had to fight, we could fight. But when we could also use it kind of as a look at this here. If you don't do what we tell you, we're going to threaten you and make you do what do what we need you to do. What was President Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy was the third lesson focused question, and it was that Wilson's attempt to create goodwill among nations with the U.S. So the U.S. could influence those nations as a moral example or set a moral example, but his foreign policy morphed into something resembling big stick diplomacy. All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to go through a few practice questions, of course, that we have for lesson 4A and 4B. Those practice questions are the following. It says, use this excerpt below to answer the question. Will in no way interfere with any treaty or port of any vested interest within any so-called sphere of influence or leased territory it may have in China. Second, that the Chinese treaty tariff of the time being shall apply to all merchandise landed or shipped to all such ports or within said sphere of interest, and that all duties so leviable shall be collected by the Chinese government. This was the open door note written by John Hay in 1899, Secretary of State John Hay in 1899. He says, what was the purpose of this policy? Well, the answer is to increase trade in China, because once again, China had all those millions and millions of people, and we wanted to access to those markets. Use the excerpt below to answer the question. The Panama Canal, I naturally take an interest in because I started it. This is the words, of course, of Theodore Roosevelt. If I had acted strictly according to precedent, I should have turned the whole matter over to Congress, in which case Congress would be ably debating it at this moment, and the canal would be 50 years in the future. Fortunately, the crisis came at a period when I could act unhampered, but while the debate goes on, the canal does too. And they are welcome to debate me as long as they wish, provided that we can go on with the canal. Theodore Roosevelt's speech, March 23, 1911, at the University of Columbia. In other words, he was saying that sometimes when you tell Congress to do stuff, they do more talking than they do doing. So while they were talking about it, he was going to be doing. And what he was doing, of course, is building the Panama Canal. Which event permitted Roosevelt to take actions described in the speech? And if you look at it, the answer would be A, the revolt against the Colombian government by the Panamanian rebels. And remember what Roosevelt did is he used their Great White Fleet, told the Panamanians to declare their independence from Colombia, parked the Great White Fleet, part of it off the coast of Colombia, and the Colombians gave in. Once again, used the Great White Fleet as the big stick to influence nations in the Western Hemisphere. Practice question number 3. Which use the list below to answer the question. The expansion of the U.S. After the Civil War, Alaska's purchase in 1867, Hawaii annexed in 1898, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines acquired in 1898. Which goal of the United States was advanced by the actions on the list? And the answer would be securing territories, of course, in strategic locations. All right, that concludes lesson number 4, lesson 4B. And what we try to do, of course, in lesson 4, 4A and 4B is to give you some ideas about how the United States of America morphed into a world power by taking over and becoming an imperialist nation and taking over nations, of course, around the world. Not necessarily taking them over in the literal sense, but taking them over in that we were able to use our influence to get them to do the things that we needed, whether by force, whether by paying them in terms of looking at loans, or by appealing to their better angels. So when you look at the United States of America in this particular period, we're going to morph into morph into taking more of a role in terms of a world or global view of the world and less of an isolationist view, even though Woodrow Wilson, of course, wanted us to be more isolationist in our approach. This is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. We hope you learned a little bit of something about American imperialism today. But remember what we always tell you, don't take my word for it. Go ahead and do your own research and, of course, arrive at your own conclusions. And with that, I'll see you next time.